These are pretty encouraging numbers, I would take.
That's right, David. So as Lisa was saying, this is another month of stronger retail sales, and potentially some people thought might come in. And it does complicate the view for the Fed in terms of, we saw job numbers come out strong in June as well. And now you're seeing retail sales. Consumers have really been the strongest part of this economy, and it looks like they're holding up. So the question will be whether this data puts more pressure on the Fed in terms of not to cut, even though we're seeing momentum really build for them to cut.
You know, Peggy, it's interesting for me to look at these numbers and wonder, is this not necessarily an indicator that the Federal Reserve will look at, because it's typically a lagging indicator. Usually the consumer falls behind the business cycle. Is that something that we're expecting to hear from the Federal Reserve?
Well, I think the Federal Reserve, given its mandate, is looking most closely at things like employment and unemployment figures. So to your point, Lisa, there are other pieces of data that they may not look at as closely, but in general, they are looking at the strength of the consumer. We saw Powell last week in his testimony basically say that the U.S. economy is in good shape, but what they're trying to do now is keep it there. And whether or not a rate cut would be what we need to keep the economy going is the question mark.
Yeah, and Peggy, it strikes me that there's this dichotomy we're seeing at various places, even with the bank earnings, the dichotomy between the consumer on the one hand and the companies on the other hand, where you have consumers spending money, it appears, we see in these retail sales numbers, whereas companies are not investing as much. I'll put up a chart here, actually, that puts two things together, which is wages and retail sales. And retail sales numbers bounce up and down, as you know. Wage rate growth has tapered off somewhat, but it's still over 3.1% year over year, which is a pretty robust number given where inflation is underlying. So I wonder how the Fed really deals with almost two different stories.
Well, right, David. I mean, certainly the question about inflation and the Fed really feeling like they haven't seen the uptick in inflation that they were expecting, given the low unemployment rate and the rise in wages somewhat. But the other question here is really, what is the business dynamic? So as you said, we have the consumer on one side that's really holding up the U.S. economy. But on the other side, we have the trade war and tariffs that are looming out there. And what is that doing to business investment and to expenditure, and what is that doing to businesses in terms of hiring? So that's a big question mark out there in terms of the dichotomy you're talking about between the consumer and business and companies and what they're looking to do going forward.
You know, Peggy, it's interesting looking through some of the numbers. 11 of the 13 major retail categories increased, and it was led by a 1.7% increase in non-store retailers. We're talking online types of operations. Interestingly, though, there was a decrease in department store sales, kind of highlighting the new economy, the new reality of retailing, which really has shifted online. How complicated is it to assess the economy when you do have these issues where there is a transformation going on led by some of the big technology companies that have revolutionized and disrupted how we buy stuff?
Lisa, I think transformation is a key word there. It has been transformative in terms of technology, not only in how automation has changed the labor force, but in terms of how consumers spend, how easily they're able to spend wherever they are at any time. We had a story out yesterday off a Goldman report that's basically looking at, are we really measuring the data well enough now that we've got all this technology out there? So I think it's a big question mark in terms of how technology is driving the consumer, not only in the U.S., but globally.